Hello and welcome to We Never Met, the podcast where I have interesting strangers on every single week. Today I have two interesting strangers. If you want to introduce yourself.
Hi, I'm Anna Warren.
I'm Sarah Heck.
And together we are Tactile Craftworks.
Oh, you had that like ready to go and rehearsed. I was like, who's going to take the last portion of it? But awesome. Yeah, that works. I guess we'll start out by sort of explaining what that is and what your business is. And then we can sort of get into like how you got into that in the first place.
So we're a leather goods company. We're a 3-woman company here in Milwaukee. Our studio is not far from the domes in the factory building. Oh. And we're largely a wholesale company, which means that the three of us, create the product together, and then we sell it to stores across the country. We have about over 200 clients now that we work with, which has been a huge kind of amount of growth in the last few years. Well,
since you guys started, so how quick has that growth been to get to because 200 is a ton. That's a lot of stores. So how did you get from where you were? I believe you guys were like selling at like farmers markets or things like that, right? So how did it start from that point and grow so extensively?
We started selling at farmers markets because we met working at a theater company, and we were laid off for the summers. So Anna would travel to Santa Fe to work with another theater company for those summers. And I was making these hand-carved leather journals that I would sell at the Eastside Green Market every Saturday. And that's kind of how it started. We worked together at the prop shop really closely. And so we knew we collaborated really well. And it wasn't long before we started making projects together. But it was maybe, 5 years before we like really kind of honed in on what the product was we were going to make. And once we figured that out, that was in 2015. And then in 2016, we did a Kickstarter to get our first laser cutter, which really kind of launched business for us. And so like the major growth really happened after 2016. So it's been in the last 4 years. Yeah.
And I was going to say, working at like a prop shop, you guys deal with a lot of different materials and a lot of different things, creating like different props and wardrobe and things like that. What was it about like leather that like stood out to you most that you were so interested in to like keep coming back to and like create a whole business out of?
Leather it's something I've always been interested in my whole life. I really took to it when I was in college. I was in a class for theater design program that was all about, it was called a period styles class. And it was about like architectural details and furniture and all sorts of things like that. And the final project was just to recreate some kind of period style piece. And there was really open-ended. So you could do you could do a quilt, you could do a stained glass window, you could do anything. And so I thought this was my chance to finally kind of try my hand at traditional leather tooling, which is something I had always thought was really beautiful looking and I was always curious about. And so I got all of the tools I needed, the basic stamping and carving tools, and created this little hand-tooled piece that took me, 15 hours. And if I were to do it now, it would take me 2. It really stuck from there. So it was a hobby that I enjoyed my whole adult life. So by the time Anna and I met, I would do some leather projects in the prop shop, like restoring books and some luggage restoration, things like that. But there's just something about the leather, about like the natural hand that it has, the variation that's in it, which can be frustrating sometimes when you're trying to grow a business and it's inconsistent, but is actually really interesting as a craftsperson to kind of try to figure out. And there's something also I think that's interesting about, I think the history of it is a really cool thing to have that kind of a craft. I mean, Anna and I are both drawn to history of objects in general. So to deal with a material that's so historic in that sense, I think is something that's been really appealing about it.
Yeah. And so Anna, when you saw her like creating these early like journals in leather, like what was like, okay, I want to be a part of that and also learn that. Was it a hard thing to learn as well?
Sarah and I are both have a lot of crafting experience throughout our lives. And so learning some of the skills wasn't particularly hard, but I will say that there are some things that Sarah has taken the lead on and that I have taken the lead on. And in honing both of those skills, I would say that both of us have put in a lot of time and effort. So really what kind of drew me into the leather was working with Sarah. I mean, we realized pretty early on that we collaborated really well. And we would just kind of sit at our tables working on our props projects and like dreaming up this business that like took many different iterations and all of our daydreaming about it. But really, I started making some little hand embroidered things. And then we tried to combine that with the leather. And then we just realized that working in the one medium would be the best. But really, it was working with Sarah that got me interested in the leather. But what really kind of brought it all together into what the business, that was really the start of what the business is today, is that we'd done a couple of craft shows. And we were trying to combine, the work that Sarah was doing with her hand-carved books and the work that I was doing with the stitching. And we went as a group with the theater to the Discovery World Museum. And they have a lab there called the Kohl's Design It Lab. And we were all there just as kind of, an exchange between a couple of Milwaukee institutions. But they had set up all of their machines and they were showing us all their machines. And we were looking at these laser cutters. And one of them said, "Oh yeah, the other day I tried laser etching something on leather." And we were like, "I'm sorry, what?" And we both just lost our minds. Like, we were such nerds. We were, such nerdy ambassadors for our organization that night. Because we just we were so excited, and the ideas happened so quickly. We were like, "Oh my gosh, we could laser etch on our journals. We could do a map of Milwaukee. We could use the shoreline as the cut line." And it was really kind of in that, that's when it all gelled. That's when this idea of maybe we could make this hobby into a business became, an actual viable idea that we could scale up and turn into a business. So that part gelled very quickly. Yeah. And then the following months, we worked with the folks at Discovery World to prototype our items. And then, as Sarah mentioned later on, we did a Kickstarter, got our own lasers, and went from there.
I was going to ask, because I was looking at all of the matte printed, laser etched leather goods. And I was like, how do they do that? Because I didn't know about the laser technology. And I'm like, that is so precise. It's that is insane to do by hand.
That being said, it took us, I feel like we only really honed kind of that skill of laser etching on leather. It took us several years to get it to the precision that we are at now.
Sure.
And that's largely Anna's work. So Anna is much more kind of technology based than I am. And we had the idea, and the first few worked, I think, better than we expected, but there just wasn't a lot of research done on laser etching on leather at the time. It's become a little bit more popular, but it was still really new. So it took us several years of, trial and error with different settings and then different types of files, different types of leather, different types of sealer, all of those. We've made improvements on that, every year since we've been in business.
Yeah, because would it burn through some of the leather, I'm assuming, and some things like that? Because, lasers are incredibly powerful.
We do. We use our lasers at a fraction of their power to get the etched lines on there. But yeah, the cutting also was an issue because you want to be able to cut through the leather without just burning it all the way into dust. So yeah, adjusting those settings for the different applications took a long time.
Yeah. And how did you guys land on sort of a travel based designs that you do, a lot of maps, a lot of as you talked about, sort of that live carving of different edges of different places in the world? Where does that come from?
That, I think, was kind of a natural progression that, looking back, just makes so much sense. Anna and I both love to travel. It's been something that's been really important for both of us throughout our lives. Anna more international travel, me more in the States, although we've both done obviously extensively both. We both, like I said before, we both have a real love for history. I think so. We've always been, interested in kind of those historic buildings, those historic places, things like that. I feel like the maps are kind of a natural progression from that. We generally work with maps that are early 1900s, although there's some movement on that, but that's the aesthetic that works for us. And then also personally, my grandfather worked for Rand McNally in Chicago for about 40 years. We try to use Rand McNally maps when we can. I think just he and I were really close. And I think that was, I have the Chicago Journal here. And this was a Rand McNally one that we did because I'm from the Chicago suburbs. So, that's just kind of a fun little tribute to that kind of family.
There you go. Yeah.
Yeah.
Is the 1900 sort of, or early 1900 maps, is that specifically because there was less highways and things like that? Or why did you choose earlier maps?
Well, there's a couple of reasons. One is aesthetically, the maps back then were usually hand-drawn or plate etched. And so there's a lot more variation and character in the maps. But another reason is that maps published before 1929 are in the public domain. And so even though we alter the maps a lot and the, creative license and everything, it gives you the right to alter things. It works aesthetically and also practically to make sure that we're okay on copyright.
That's crazy. So they're copyrighted? Why are they copyrighted?
Some are and some aren't. A lot of maps were put out by travel companies. AAA would put out a travel flyer that would say, visit Miami, and then it would sell the little ad. So it was a little flyer that they were making. Or, oftentimes they're government maps. And so, copyright might not be an issue, but we just want to make sure. And luckily for us, it also they're more beautiful. They're usually, I should say, like more beautiful, and you get that real human touch in there.
Yeah, that's an interesting tidbit of like trivia knowledge, though, that people should know.
Yeah. And also we include the date of each map that we use in our maker mark on the back.
Oh, cool.
One thing, though, that we recently have been discussing about using the earlier maps, which is not something we really had considered before, is that, obviously cities change drastically and sometimes quickly. One of the things that we're running into is that when we use maps of downtown areas from the early 1900s, there are times that now that's leaving out really vibrant parts of cities that we are now reconsidering what that looks like or what that might mean or the implications of that.
Sure.
So that's been a kind of a recent conversation that is I don't think will necessarily change how we practice things, but something that we're just more aware of kind of moving forward, and that we're not leaving out communities that we don't want to leave out.
Yeah. And this might be a really dumb question, but when you put like a map of a city on like a journal or something like that, how much of the city can you actually fit? Because I mean, like there's certain dimensions, obviously you can't just like go over the edge. So how do you like frame up where you want it to be and like where the edges are going to cut off and things like that?
It totally depends on the map. Part of it is that we will take a look at the map that we've got, and the first thing that we decide is how we're going to orient it. Is it going to be up and down? We love it when we can just keep north and south, up and down. But sometimes based on the river or where we're going to make the cut line, we have to turn it. But then we try and find as many friends as we can that live in that city or have visited that city, and say, okay, what are the most important places? So like we're currently working on one of the next cities that's going to come out is Mexico City. And luckily one of our friends here in town, she's also an entrepreneur and she grew up in Mexico City. So we sent her the map, and so she circled those places for us. And then Sarah was able to do the design of the map to make sure she was including those places that would be most important to the people who had lived in the city.
And so were you guys both very like entrepreneurial when you were younger? I mean, were you creating stuff at a young age, or was this sort of something that the tactile, I guess, creation of things that came later in life when you started doing like props and things like that?
I mean, I had a friendship bracelet business when I was in the second grade.
that counts.
I'm an older sister, so I like to boss people around a lot. So I was like the one that would like make these informal clubs in my neighborhood of like, okay, guys, but now we're all doing a recycling club and I'm the president.
I'm the manager of everyone.
Yes, exactly.
Oh yeah, that's awesome. Did anything before this, like the leatherworking, was there any other ideas for any other directions you guys wanted to go? Or was it like very firmly leather?
Well,
the mess before.
The joke was that I decided at some point, just on a whim, that I wanted to make, I think it was because all of the fancy cake baking shows were coming out. So I decided I wanted to make fancy wedding cakes. And then I decided I wanted to make cupcakes, and I was going to sell them to drunk people on Water Street. And then it was going to be a bakery with a craft business. And by then I'd figured out that Sarah and I had to work together. So then we just kept adding. So at some point it was like, it's going to be this giant warehouse. It's going to be a bakery where people can have a craft workshop or get married. There's going to be a tattoo parlor. There's going to be a circus in the back. There's going to be a screen printing. Like it was just like basically like everything that we ever enjoyed doing would be in this massive business complex. Obviously
a joke, but
down.
Right. But like in that process, when we started with the leather stuff, we anticipated taking those same designs that we were putting on the leather and putting them on things like textiles. And we didn't intend to stay so specifically leather.
Right.
But really, I think that was a massive part of learning, how business works in general, was just figuring out how to not be all things to all people, because that's impossible and it's just not a good business model. And so as years have gone by, we've gotten more and more specific. And so really focusing on the leather was a big part of that.
Yeah, you basically have someone come in and, what do you want? Oh, I want a screen printed shirt. Okay, we'll do that. 1 second.
Yeah. Exactly.
Just give me a minute. I need to go find the screen printer. Did it happen sort of, because me and my fiance talk about this a little bit and I'm sure this relates to you in traveling as well, that like you don't really know what you like and you don't like until you go, like in the city, like for example, like living there, you don't really know, like you can think about what you like or what you don't like, but until you experience it, you don't really know. And is that sort of what it was with like once you started sort of Did you try like other things like you talked about, even though it was a joke, like screen printing? You're like, oh, okay, this is not for me.
We did. Yeah. And actually, this is one of the things that we talk a lot that our theater training really served us well. Because when you do theater, you make these items, you spend a lot of time and energy and resources to make something that's going to be on stage, usually for a couple of weeks. Sometimes it's only on stage for a couple minutes. And then at the end, it'll either, this thing is on stage 3 weeks, show closes. Sometimes it goes into storage. Sometimes it goes in the dumpster. Sure. And sometimes you put it on stage once in tech and the director sees it and it's like, oh, that's not going to work. And even though you've worked 3 weeks on it, it never gets seen by anyone else. Sure. So when you're a props person, you get, and a theater person generally, I think you get really good at letting go of things that don't work in a way that we found not all business people do. So some people start with one idea of what they want their business to be, and they'll just push that idea until they either make it work or don't. And part of our philosophy has always been like, try it. And if it doesn't work, let it go. And if it does work, make it better.
Yeah, I think going off on that, I think it's why we both now consider, like, even though we both adore our products and really love what we make, it's not an exact replica of our own personal aesthetics.
Right.
It's certainly things that we love and we are drawn to and we love to make. But as our own personal aesthetics evolve over time, the business has to stay consistent in that branding. And so I think that's been also kind of an interesting lesson to learn, is that, we want to obviously make something that we love and we're proud of, but it doesn't have to be an exact reflection of who we are also.
Yeah, that's interesting. I also want to talk to you because something you mentioned before about you guys are both very interested in like the history of objects. So what about like the history of objects is really like interesting and fascinating to you?
One of the first projects that Sarah and I worked on together at the prop shop was really exciting. And basically it was for this one person show. And this person was a great collector of things. And so they would tell these stories about the prized items in their collection. And it was set up to be done in this very tiny way where someone has this box of this dollhouse furniture and they have these little pieces that are representing the real pieces. And so Sarah was working on those little pieces. And so this person would take the tiny chair out and tell the detail and tell the story about why this chair is important to them and what the details were. And so Sarah went and researched all those tiny details and made the little chair. And then I made this box, and we wanted to show this box had been like sitting in this person's collection and use. So we looked at like how a velvet covered box would be worn, how the handle would have made the indentation into the velvet as it was sitting on the shelf, how it would have faded. And so, it's not just some box that we bought at the store and then put on stage. It was a box that looked like this person had touched it and opened it and treasured each item. You could tell like in how we made it. Oh, sorry, that was my dog making a cameo. But you could tell in this object when you saw it on stage, that it had just the story behind it, that it had been touched and loved and guarded. And I think it's like that when you go to the thrift store, you pick up this object and you see the chip on it and you're like, oh, someone wasn't just leaving this on the shelf. Someone was using this for dinner every night because they loved it, or, things like that. You just think about all of the people who touched this thing and held this thing and how it affected them. That was a rambly answer.
Great. But I think beyond that, it's so much of what is being produced now is so temporary. It's so disposable. It's not meant to stick around. And I think the items around that really have the most meaning are things that are, either, passed down or are still around because they were well made. And that is something that like has always been interesting to us. I think especially it's something that like I found I got really burned out on and working in the prop shop was that it was, even though we had the opportunity to do all this beautiful research and create all of these cool things, that temporary nature really became exhausting. There's this draw to kind of create something that might be around for a long time. And, we really try to create a product that will last for generations, the kind of thing that people will pass down, and so I think like that kind of history, when something is passed to each other like that, it's, I think it's a really fascinating thing. Or when somebody has something for so long that you can see the wear they've put on it themselves. It's like having, your favorite old t-shirt that like maybe when you first got it wasn't your favorite t-shirt, but 15 years later is the most comfortable thing you own. You know what I mean? Like there's something that's really valuable to the time that you put into an object.
And I think also to what Sarah said really speaks to how I think Sarah especially felt as a craftsperson, that, usually when you make a prop, it's something that you've never made before. You make once and you never make again. And oftentimes you think, man, if I could do this again, I'd do it so much better than the first time. But you don't get a chance to really hone the skills. Like Sarah particularly is a person that wants everything to be as good as it can be. And so doing this leather work, we actually get to like look at every object. Like we still make edits to the Milwaukee Journal we've been making for years now. And we still like recently found some little thing on it where we're like, that line shouldn't be there or whatever it was. And it's like, no, we can continue to make our craft better. And that's interesting as craftspeople in a different way than, broadening our craft, that, narrowing our craft can be very satisfying in that way.
For sure.
Yeah, I think there's something too to having like some concrete object, especially in a day now where there's so many like digital copies of things and online, and there's no like actually physical things that you can show for. Like I can't pass on my Twitter account to my kids, what I mean? Like you just can't do that. So, but no, I completely agree. I go to thrift store sometimes and just look at different objects and been like, how did someone use this? Like, I wonder like how this was in their house or like where it was or like what it meant to them. It's just really interesting. You guys are very connected. We talked about travel a little bit with like the national parks and things like that. I read, Sarah, that you're trying to go to every single one.
That's well, the 62 official national parks.
Okay. How many have you been to?
421 national park sites,
okay.
Which people do, and I think is impressive. That is not the goal. The goal is the 62.
How fast do you think you could complete that though? 400 and some, that would take
so
long.
Yeah. There was one guy I used to follow that it was like he made it his goal. Like I think he saw all of them in like 3 years or something. It was insane.
Oh, he must have not worked or something.
No, yeah, it was a full-time road trip. Yeah.
Yeah. Wow. So how many have you been to? Like the official
19. I've been to 19 now.
Okay. And because you guys donate a portion of like the national park passport cover, is that right?
Actually, all of the products in our park line. So anything that we make that has a national park or that pine tree design on it, a portion of the sales of that goes to the National Park Foundation.
So how did you start that relationship, and why did you decide that was an important one to? I mean, it's definitely important now, the way they're getting funded for sure.
Yeah,
but, so how did you decide, or how did that relationship start?
One of the things that Anna and I talked about in running a business from the very beginning, before we even decided what exactly it was that we wanted to do, was that we wanted to do something, or we wanted to somehow make a difference in any way that we could. Working in theater, you get the feeling that like that's the goal. That's why most people get into theater, right? Is because they want to make a difference. That is sometimes effective and sometimes not. And so we were, early on talking about how, if we just start a leather goods company, how does that affect anything? How is that good for anybody? Yes, there's value in creating beautiful things. We were looking to be a little bit more hands-on than that. And so it was early on in our mission that we decided that we really wanted to give back when we could. And we do that often for many, many different organizations, depending on the year, depending on, kind of current events, things like that. But we knew that starting the park line, that was something that we could easily facilitate that constantly, as opposed to, running a sale for a weekend or something like that. It just made sense. I was, completely obsessed with the national parks, still am. And so the National Park Foundation is the official sponsor of the national parks. And so it kind of made sense that they were the organization that would spend it most wisely and, put the money most where it needed to be. That's been a really cool thing to kind of see that amount grow, over the last few years, and to see how we can, something like our leather goods company is making a tangible difference in something that we really care about, and an important subject that really does need support. That's a fun, really satisfying side of the business that we always kind of hoped would put into place, and has been really great to see that it has worked so far.
Yeah, and I want to ask both of you this question. So do you guys still have like your early leather works? Like, do you save any of those? Like, can you compare like what it used to be like to what it is now, and how has that changed? What have you gotten? What were you really bad at the beginning that you've gotten so much better at now? Is my question.
I wish I had some to show you, because we've kept some of our early prototypes. When we first started There were so many things that we did by hand that we didn't have the tools to do. So, like even when we were laser etching, our first laser didn't do a great job of cutting through the leather. It did a really good job of etching. And so we were hand cutting all of the edges. And so like you look at our first ones and it's like, wow, somebody sure took a scissors to this. But also we were punching all the holes by hand. We were cutting every mug blank out by hand, you know, and now the growing has given us the opportunity to buy a punch with dies that are cut. So now every single mug is exactly the same size and all of the holes are punched perfectly, where before it was just sitting there with a little punch like yeah. So the accuracy has gotten far better, I think.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, and in relation to that, our finishing work as well. So we used to use a different kind of sealer than we use now, until we realized that after a year or two of use, it was starting to crack, and so you would start to see this kind of white film on the top of the leather. So that was something we had to address, where we actually now have a custom made sealer for us. We also used to not finish our edges. So all of our journals you would see, and because we were hand cutting them out, there was just a rough edge. And so now that we actually laser cut everything out, it gives us a much more precise edge that we can now, we do a beeswax finishing, and that beeswax comes from Anna's bees in her backyard, which is really awesome. So it's all kind of hyper local like that. And so not only does it look much more finished because it just has a nice glossy edge and all of that, but because it's laser cut, it also has that black finish. So it just, everything looks more complete.
We also actually totally buried the lead on this one, which is that we have our own leather now. So when we started, you know, we only had the resources to go to the leather craft store and buy, you know, like a half a piece at a time. And when we started working with our current tannery, which is Tactile here in Milwaukee, they used to let us come and pick through their seconds and overruns. So we were still just buying, you know, one side at a time. So eventually what we did is we saved up all these little scraps of these are the leathers that etch really well. These are the leathers that etch really badly, but we couldn't guarantee colors to our customers. You know, we'd say like, it'll be a light brown or a dark brown. And so eventually we worked with the folks at Tactile to use one of the leathers that they were making, but finish it specifically for our process. Now they're making a leather specifically for us. So it's our Atlas leather, and they're making this beautiful tannage that it doesn't have the last layer of finishing on it. So we put that on, and it etches beautifully and has beautiful figuration on it, and just really lovely. So that's actually, I would say, the biggest thing is that we have our own leather now.
Wait, so you have bees in your backyard? Do you have a hive?
I do. I have 2 hives. Yep.
That's always been a dream of mine. And I don't have a yard right now, but so do you get honey as well then? Local honey?
We do. Yep. And I would say, like, as soon as you have the space, do it. My husband is really the you know, the guy who's like researches all of it and does it, but I love having them. You just sit there and watch them all day. They're wonderful. So anybody who thinks they want to do bees, do it.
Do you have to like take them out yourself or anything, or do you have someone do that for you?
Okay, I'm just going to say my husband is glaring at me, and he wants me to add, if you're going to do beekeeping, do it and do it well. Don't do it poorly, or you'll ruin things for the local bees. Yeah, no, it's great. So you have these boxes of bees, and they have frames that they build on. And, you know, roughly in the summer, once a month, you go in, you pull the frames out, you make sure they're doing okay. About once or twice a year, you treat them for things like mites and fungus and things like that. Mostly what you want to do is you're just making sure that they have the resources to do their thing well. So you want to make sure that what they have is clean, that they're not getting any disease, that they have enough, you know, pollen and nectar and food if you need to feed them, things like that. So do it. And as my husband is nodding at me and he's like, do it well, do your research. It's very important if you want to support the bees to support them well.
Yeah.
There we go.
or find someone that can do it well. Cause I did actually a video on, I think it's called Dragonfly Honey. And basically it's a beekeeper who goes to people's houses and puts beehives in your backyard if you want one.
That's great.
Awesome.
Yeah. But yeah, it was really scary when they're very calm, the bees, but like they're still flying around you all the time. You know, it's something you have to get used to. Yeah, that's really cool. So I guess, how does the beeswax work in sealing or like working with leather? I never heard of that before.
Yeah, so it's actually a pretty traditional process, and there are lots of different materials that people use or not materials. There are a lot of different products that people use to seal the edges. Just because when you tan a piece of leather, it does kind of you're basically stuffing it with oils and waxes that help create some kind of a seal or protection on it. When you cut into the side of it, that edge is somewhat exposed because it doesn't have that finishing product on it. So it doesn't really harm it in any way. It just, it might be a little easier to stain, and it really is just a matter of aesthetics, wanting to finish a product well. So the beeswax, not only it gives it a nice glossy finish, when you're stacking two pieces of leather together, the goal is to kind of get it so precise that you can't see the different layers, but it looks like one piece. And so you kind of drag the wax along it. And then we use a Dremel rotary tool with this specific wooden bit that actually kind of melts the wax into the edge and creates this glossy finish that also is a bit protective as well. The leather we use is a bit of a softer hand. That's for the journals and the passport wallets and the clutches. We also use what's called a vegetable tanned leather for our travel mugs and flasks. And vegetable tan leather, so 1800s, when leather was much more utilitarian product. So it was, made for things like saddles and boots, and that was its main goal, to be really utilitarian. That's all vegetable tanned leather. And so the vegetable tan, the tanning is done with natural materials. It's barks and leaves and things like that. It's a much, much longer process. And so it's generally much more expensive. That's the kind of leather that was by far the most produced in the 1800s. Now, about 5% of leather that's produced in the US is vegetable tanned. It's all now chemical tan, just because people don't need it for that utilitarian job as much anymore. It's more of a luxury good. So, but the vegetable tan, you have to use vegetable tan leather for the hand carving that I do. So, and because it's a little bit more utilitarian, we use it we use it for the mugs and the flasks because it just has a little bit more body to it. It's stand up to the wear and tear of, being around liquids and,
Sure.
being in and out of a back pocket or, thrown in a bag or something like that.
Do you guys each have a favorite product that you've created over the years, or maybe even a recent one that you've created?
I mean, I'm going to say, I think the Milwaukee Journal is still my favorite. Milwaukee's been my hometown since I was 6. It's, kind of the product that started it all, and it's only gotten better as we've been making it over the years. So my favorite thing to make is a mug because I love to stitch them. But my favorite, the thing that I would say is probably my favorite Tactile Craftworks product is the Milwaukee Journal.
Yeah, I obviously am very partial to the Chicago Journal for similar reasons, which was the second journal we made. It's a very kind of emotional connection to it. We recently collaborated on this project, which we intend to do more of, which was the first one in a line called the Heritage Series that we started, where because we do less of the hand carving, just because we're dealing more in larger production than that, we decided that we wanted to kind of launch a line that really highlighted Anna's pattern making and my hand carving, and do really limited runs of numbered edition things. So we won't do the pattern again. And so we did a series of flasks. I have one, it's not the exact pattern because we sold the 6 that we did, but this is one I made for myself. So it's this kind of cool little pattern that's all hand carved and hand stitched, but it's also got this cool little sleeve, and the whole flask comes out.
Oh,
and it's
nice.
this little design that Anna did the patterning on, and then I did the decoration on that. And there's just something that's really cool about that kind of collaborative, project of going back to something that we really both use those hands-on skills in a way that we don't necessarily get to quite as often anymore. And so that was a fun one to do.
So where can people find more about your work and social media, your website, things like that?
Yeah. So our website is just tactilecraftworks.com, and our social media, we are most active on Instagram, and that's just also at Tactile Craftworks. We're also on Facebook. We are technically on Twitter, but we don't use it. We really should. That's something I should really, get better at, because we're, mostly a visual-based company. Instagram is kind of, where we do the majority of our work. You can also sign up for our email list and get a 15% coupon. You'll see that on our website.
Well, thank you so much. I appreciate talking to both of you. Your work is amazing, so I'm so glad to have you both on.
Thank you
so much for having us. This was fun.
Yeah.
Have a great day.
You too.